Subnautica Below Zero is a complicated sequel. It's got some neat new features like fancy environments, a funky soundtrack, and some great base building additions. But on the other hand, there's a lot of debate on how it changed compared to the first. Common topics are the lack of horror elements and a very fragmented storyline. I covered those topics and more in a past video, so I won't get into that discussion here. Instead, I returned to the game months after first beating it, looking for a new challenge. It isn't very controversial to say that Below Zero is a pretty easy game. Sure, it might take a while to explore everywhere and complete the storyline, but it's rarely difficult. There are a handful of mods out there, but none really focused on the super hard difficulty like the Death Run mod for the first game. In a previous video I made on the original Subnautica, I installed the Death Run mod to see what it had to offer. It took countless gameplay elements and twisted them in sinister ways to make for an excruciating, if not pretty interesting experience. Since Below Zero doesn't have an equivalent mod, I decided to create what I like to call the Below Zero Nightmare Run. To set things up, I installed just two mods. The Depths BZ shader, which overhauls the visuals of the entire game, and Vitality, which lets you modify numerous game values. The shader was designed with horror in mind, making things pretty high contrast, lower saturation, and extremely dark at times. As you can see, the toon graphics make it almost impossible to see at night or in dark areas without a flashlight. With sufficient visuals for a nightmare mode, I now had to decide how hard to actually tune the game. I thought about this for a long time, trying to push the envelope on extreme difficulty while still being playable. I set hunger, thirst, and cold multipliers to 2. Meaning the food, water, and warmth bars would drain twice as fast. I also set the damage multiplier to 4, meaning everything was extremely dangerous, with 25 damage being enough to instant kill me. But the real wrench in this whole run was when I set the oxygen capacity to 1 second. When I first tried setting it to 0 seconds, the game just thought I had infinite oxygen. So instead, I had a single second of oxygen, basically meaning I entered the drowning state as soon as I went underwater. The game gives you a couple of seconds when you're drowning until you actually die, so I could go underwater, but not very far at all. To make things even worse, the screen darkens as soon as you start drowning, and the shader mod I installed just amplified this. After just a few seconds underwater, I was completely blind, having to scramble to safety in the remaining seconds. This would happen every time I entered the water for the entire game, plus all those other challenges I put on top. Things weren't looking good right from the start, but the Nightmare Run had to live up to its name, and I was ready for the challenge. I started the game as you would with any run, sticking near the life pod and crafting all the early game tools to get going. Unfortunately for me, this took about 10 times longer than it normally would have. With no oxygen supply, I had to locate materials I needed from the surface, swim down to quickly grab them, and then hope I had enough air to make it back to the surface alive. I also had to frequently stop to collect fish to keep my rapidly dwindling hunger and thirst at bay. The scanner was my first required item, but the air bladder and fins helped speed things up a bit. I could dive a little deeper down and then boost back up to the surface as soon as the screen turned completely black. After I had crafted the bare necessities, I decided to make my way over to Delta Station. I had a good sense of where the island was without a beacon, but those angry critters on the way were a real concern. I didn't have a sea glide or any vehicle that would let me outrun them. Plus, a single bite would definitely be fatal. I just had to swim along the surface and sneak my way onto the island. Once I arrived, I said hi to Marguerite, who ran off and left me with a convenient map marker for the lily pad biome. After that, I scanned up everything in Delta Station, making extra sure to get the habitat builder and the modification station recipes. With that out of the way, I made the long, dark swim back to the life pod. Despite the annoyances of the shader I was using, the heavy snowstorm blowing across the vast night ocean looked pretty cool. My next goal was getting a sea glide to speed things up a bit. This required not only finding fragments, but finding ones that were very close to the surface. I had to swim down and fully scan each fragment moments before I drowned. I did manage to put a sea glide together, but the restrictions of this run made even a simple task like this take far too long. Even though I had the habitat builder blueprint, I couldn't make one without first making a computer chip. I could get all the materials close to the surface, with the exception of table coral. I searched all over, but any coral I found was at least 100 meters down, if not even deeper. There was no way I could make it down there with my limited oxygen supply. I tried just about every possible solution, including getting air from a bladderfish, oxygen plants, and the air bladder. The 1 second of oxygen could be refilled, but it didn't reset the drowning timer, so I still died 1 second later. Right when I was about ready to take a break, I remembered those silly little air pipes that nobody uses. They were so inconvenient to craft, carry, and set up that I totally forgot they even made it into below zero. So I crafted an air pump and slowly placed pipes down into the lower reaches of the twisty bridges. I had to make sure to place lots of extra pipes along the way because it's very hard to swim between them in the pitch black water. After countless runs of collecting materials, returning to the life pod, crafting pipes, and taking them back to the twisty bridges, I finally reached some table coral. I used this to make a computer chip, which let me make the habitat builder, which I then used to make a small base at the bottom of my pipe network. I also built a sea truck for some long distance travel. After all that time spent nearly drowning, I decided to do a little land exploration. First up was Phi Robotics Center. Blueprints for things like the snow fox were helpful, but I especially wanted to stock up on fevered peppers. These things take up minimal space and restore a good amount of food, water, and heat. They can be grown easily in small plant pots and yield a handful of peppers each. Plus, they were a handy way to not freeze, because I had no intentions of farming materials for the cold suit. While I was on the topic of land exploration, I took a quick trip to Outpost Zero, mostly for the prawn suit, but things like the water filtration system were a nice plus. It was somewhere around this point that my sea truck got insta-killed by an angry fish, so I had to quit out and reload instead of making an entirely new one. Speaking of vehicles, that brings us to my next dilemma. How could I go any deeper? Well, depth modules of course, but those required some things I didn't have yet. My shopping list contained 3 missing items: diamonds, rubies, and synthetic fibers, all necessary for getting down to the deeper biomes and continuing the story. Vehicles can't be driven inside the vent gardens to harvest the spiral plants needed for the fibers, so they'd have to be taken from the deep purple vents instead. Although I wasn't very keen on the idea of getting one shot by the chelicerate on my way down and back, so I considered some other options. Very conveniently, I remembered that there were some synthetic fibers right next to the frozen Leviathan, so I made a quick detour over there on a freshly built snow fox that exploded at the lightest touch of anything nearby. After having to quit out and reload countless times, I was back home with some fresh new synthetic fibers. My next task was picking up Alan, but my sea truck couldn't drive down low enough to get me there, and I obviously couldn't swim through the tunnels using the oxygen plants like the game expects you to. So I went with the same old plan as before and began setting up a very long pipe network down into the caves. Unfortunately, my game crashed for seemingly no reason, and I forgot to start recording when I reopened the game. So there's a tiny bit of missing footage here, but luckily not that much. I mostly just finished my pipe network down to Alan's place and picked him up. After that I put the game down for the day, and thankfully remembered to start recording the next day. The next order of business were those diamonds and rubies I mentioned earlier. I knew that I could get handfuls of them in the Kappa mining site, but the sea truck was too large to fit inside the doors. There is a secret back door through some caves to drive the sea truck in, but even that didn't matter that much. I needed diamonds to make enameled glass, which was required for both the sea truck depth module and the prawn suit. Even if I got the sea truck into the site, I couldn't take it deep enough to grab the diamonds I needed. My only obvious option was to spend a few hours building an extremely long pipe network down through the entire mining site, but that didn't sound appealing at all. This meant going back to the drawing board. I put the game down for a few days and thought about this over and over until I finally had an epiphany. Remember those annoying sea monkeys from the beginning of the game? Well, once you've found Alan, instead of stealing from you, they bring you random resources. Lots of people know that, but did you know that they'll actually bring you materials for almost any blueprint that you have pinned? With a little patience, you can get almost any material in the game from them, aside from some rare ones like kyanite. It was as simple as pinning enameled glass and depth module recipes, and waiting for the diamonds and rubies to roll in. With my newfound riches, I crafted a prawn suit and made my way back to the mining site. Now, one quirk of the game is that drowning outside of your sea truck respawns you inside the sea truck, but drowning outside of a prawn suit respawns you back at your last base. This was obviously a big issue, given that I drowned at least once an hour or so. Like I said, that screen darkening plus the shader makes it nearly impossible to see as soon as you lose oxygen. I could just continue on if I died outside my sea truck, but every death outside the prawn required a full quit and reload. Oh, and Subnautica only allows you to have one save file per game. If you accidentally hit save after something goes wrong, you can't just quit and reload back to the old one anymore. See where I'm going with this? Well, all of these things managed to come together into an absolutely perfect storm of pain and suffering. You see, while I was down in the mines, I wanted to scan the alien artifact to save some time. I thought it was required for the story, and didn't even find out until later that it's completely optional. The cave entrance to it is too small for anything but a sea glide to go through. I could swim in and scan it, but I'd drown and end up at my last base with no possible way of recovering my prawn. So I had the idea to build a small base right near the cave entrance. This would have worked fine, but I drowned while putting the base together, and that's where everything fell apart. Since drowning would put me back in my last base, I had to quit and reload to actually end up back in the prawn. But I pressed the menu button and clicked at the same time, accidentally hitting save instead of quit like I wanted. This meant that my death was permanently saved to my file. I was going to respawn back in my base outside the mining site, with no possible way to get back to my prawn. I just sat there for a minute, completely stunned at what happened. Knowing there was no way to get my save back, I closed the game and honestly considered ending the run altogether. This was by far the darkest point I've ever had in a Subnautica run. The desire to uninstall the game and delete all this footage was pretty strong, but I couldn't just give up on everyone who I knew would be watching. You guys came here for a nearly impossible below zero challenge, and I was going to try everything in my power to make it happen. That leaves us with a few big questions. Will I get my prawn back? Is it even possible to go deeper? And what about all those leviathans in the way? Well, tune in next week for the thrilling conclusion of the below zero nightmare run. Feel free to subscribe if you don't want to miss the follow-up, or leave a comment if you have some early predictions. Otherwise, I'll see you all in the next one.